At a first glance, Saudi Arabia and Russia have not much in common in terms of foreign policy. The former is one of America's closest allies, whereas the latter is its main geostrategic competitor along with China. But in the complex geopolitics of the Middle East, their bilateral relations are more multifaceted than it may seem, and recent events may drive them closer. I'm your host Kasim, welcome to another KJ vid. In this video we will discuss the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But just before we start, we encourage you to visit our Patreon page and consider becoming our member, which would significantly help our channel. Due to the geographical distance, there is practically no direct issues at stake in Saudi-Russian relations, yet the two countries pursue their national interests all over the region, and their objectives converge in some cases and diverge in others. The most important shared interest between the two powers is their dependence on oil exports. In fact, Russia and Saudi Arabia are two of the world's top oil producers, and export revenues are a central source of income for both. As such, they need to ensure that the price of oil remains sufficiently elevated, and in this optic they have been coordinating their output to avoid oversupplying the international markets, so to keep its price high enough to preserve their economies. But apart from that, Moscow's and Riyadh's geopolitical goals are divergent in most other issues. The first and most important factor in this regard is Iran. The Saudi monarchy, supported by the US, considers Iran as its major rival in the region, and it is actively acting to counter its growing influence in Iraq, Syria and Yemen. However, Moscow cooperates with Tehran, seeing it as an important partner to balance America's influence in the Middle East and favour the emergence of a multipolar world more compatible with its own geopolitical plans. This allows to introduce another major conflict that complicates the Saudi-Russian relations: the war in Syria. Since the beginning, Moscow has backed al-Assad's regime to the point of dispatching its armed forces to assist in it overcoming the rebels supported by the West and some Middle Eastern powers including Saudi Arabia. The kingdom was initially firm in demanding al-Assad's demise, but as the war turned into his favour thanks to Russia's support, Riyadh gradually moderated its stance. But in this thorny conflict, Iran is also a factor to consider. It had plans to build a pipeline to export its hydrocarbons to Europe via northern Iraq and Syria, and this is another factor because of which it supports al-Assad. In this sense, its interests converge with Moscow's, whose involvement in the war is also explained by its willingness to access the Eastern Mediterranean and participate to the competition over oil and especially gas that is taking place there. So both Russia and Iran are driven by the desire to expand their influence and to pursue their energy-related interests. But their cooperation in Syria is of course seen negatively in Riyadh, thus complicating its relations with Moscow. There are also two other issues involving the Tehran-Riyadh rivalry in which Moscow is indirectly implied. The first is the blockade on Qatar imposed by Saudi Arabia and other countries who accused it of sponsoring terrorism, even though the real geopolitical reason is that Qatar is too close to Iran. Russia adopted a neutral stance in this matter, offering to mediate in June 2017. Something similar is happening in the second case, namely the war in Yemen. As a matter of fact, Moscow maintains positive relations with the Yemeni government, who is battling the Iran-sponsored Houthi rebels with the help of a Saudi-led coalition, but at the same time it has also developed a partnership with Tehran. As a result, Russia has decided not to take side in the conflict. Then there are two important players whose relations with Saudi Arabia and Russia have been changing recently: Israel and Turkey. The former's case is easier to explain. A traditional US ally, Tel Aviv's partnership with Washington has grown even stronger now that Trump is president. Israel also opposes al-Assad and Iran-backed militias in Syria, and all this has complicated its relations with Russia. At the same time, these very facts, combined with Israel's approval of the blockade on Qatar and the mutual friendliness to the US, have been the driver of a slow and informal but strategically important rapprochement between Israel and the Saudi kingdom. So the respective stance towards Tel Aviv is another matter of divergence in Moscow-Riyadh relations. The same applies to Turkey's role. Recently, Saudi-Turkish relations have been deteriorating due to a series of factors. Turkey firmly supported Qatar and has been flirting with Iran. Also, President Erdogan engaged in a harsh exchange of words with Israel's Netanyahu due to the former's support for Palestinians and to competing energy interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Partly due to this, Ankara's partnership with Washington has suffered while its ties with Moscow improved. Egypt's position is also worth mentioning. Its relations with Turkey are at a low point due to the latter's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and to diverging interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. On the contrary, the Saudis support the current government of President al-Sisi. In this context, it is notable that Egypt and Turkey took opposite sides on the Qatar blockade, with the former taking part to it and the latter offering aid to the small Gulf state. Last but not least, the Khashoggi episode sparked a severe diplomatic row between Ankara and Riyadh. In short, relations with Turkey are another point of contrast between Saudi Arabia and Russia. To sum up, the current regional dynamics see a Moscow-Tehran-Ankara entente opposing a Riyadh-Washington-Tel Aviv-Cairo alignment. These are not stone-made blocks, and it is possible that things will change again in the future, but recent trends have led to their consolidation, and it seems reasonable that things will go in that direction for the time being. This means that Saudi Arabia and Russia find themselves on the opposite sides of the two informal coalitions. In this, their respective stance towards the US play an important part. While Moscow is one of Washington's main rivals, Riyadh is a decade-old ally. The Americans support the ruling House of Saud, supply Saudi Arabia with arms, and allow the rich monarchy to enrich itself by selling oil in exchange of precious petrodollars. Yet US-Saudi relations have recently become more complicated in the wake of the mediatic scandal that followed the killing of Khashoggi, which attracted much criticism from the international community. Yet President Trump considers the kingdom as an essential ally to contain Iran, and it should not be forgotten that his first official trip abroad after entering into the White House was to Saudi Arabia, where he signed a multi-billion-dollar arms agreement. Because of this, he adopted a cautious stance to avoid damaging relations with its pivotal Middle Eastern partner, and as the mediatic storm of the Khashoggi episode calms down, the US will continue supporting the Saudis as before. Yet the most recent events, and especially the Khashoggi affair, have opened new room for cooperation between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which may have important consequences in the long term. While being traditionally aligned with the West, and especially the US, the Saudis have found themselves under heavy criticism following the Khashoggi episode. Many voices arose in Europe and America, even at the highest level of the state, demanding to halt arms sales to the kingdom, pressurizing it to stop its military operations in Yemen out of humanitarian concerns, and criticizing the policies of Crown Prince bin Salman. Now, these demands rarely transformed into practice. Various countries, most notably the US, have refused to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and the condemnation of Khashoggi's murder has often remained just rhetorical. Still, at the diplomatic level, the kingdom found itself suddenly isolated. This will likely be a short-term problem, because as the mediatic exposure that followed Khashoggi's death wanes, geopolitical concerns will prevail and Western powers will continue supporting Riyadh. Nevertheless, the Saudis have understood that it is necessary to diversify their partners so as to hedge against the risk of losing support from the West, and in this sense Russia appeared like the ideal choice. First, it is a great military power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Second, the two need to coordinate them over oil production, and this is easier when maintaining good relations. Third, both polities are ruled by a strongman who is at the centre of political life. But having closer ties with Saudi Arabia is also advantageous from Russia's point of view. It allows to diversify its partnerships in the Middle East that now are largely based on Iran and Syria, thus reducing the risks of over-reliance on them. Also, it helps countering America's influence in the region, and harmonizing oil production is also a matter of concern in Moscow. This explains the war meeting between Prince bin Salman and President Putin during the latest G20 in Argentina, in spite of the numerous points of contrast between the two countries. They discussed bilateral cooperation, notably over oil production. Putin is also expected to visit Saudi Arabia soon, so to reciprocate King Salman's visit to Moscow in 2017. But there is more. Riyadh is also negotiating the purchase of Russian-made weaponry, including the advanced S-400 anti-aircraft system, something that the US would surely not appreciate. On this basis, some have even said that Saudi Arabia is pivoting towards Russia, but this statement seems exaggerated. The common interest and the recent rapprochement notwithstanding, it is unlikely that the kingdom will make Russia the main element of its foreign policy, as the term pivoting implies. Major obstacles do remain, notably Moscow's partnership with Tehran and Riyadh's ties with Washington. In this regard, it is likely that America will remain the main partner for Saudi Arabia, also because the prospect of having it falling in Russia's sphere of influence is unacceptable for America, who will therefore act to prevent this by reaffirming its support for the kingdom. Yet greater Saudi-Russian cooperation may actually take place in coming years, especially if a less pro-Riyadh president than Trump were to enter into the White House following the 2020 elections in the US, and this may have broader implications in the ever-changing geopolitics of the Middle East. That's all for today guys, thanks for watching another KJ vid. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, we encourage you to visit our Patreon page and consider becoming our member, which would significantly help our channel and allow us to remain independent in our political research. Please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and check out the important links in the description. Also be sure to leave your comments and questions and we'll try our best to answer them. Thanks for watching again and see you next time.